The morning sun rose over the wide Texas plains, painting the dry hills with soft gold. A wagon rolled slowly down the dirt road, carrying a young woman who sat holding a small brown suitcase close to her chest. Her name was Clara Hill, and she had come a long way. The air was hot and smelled of dust and horses. Her hands were rough from travel, and her face showed both fear and hope. She had answered a newspaper ad for a ranch cook. The pay was small, but it was her only chance to start a new life after losing her mother. When the wagon stopped in front of the Turner Ranch, Clara stepped down carefully. A group of cowboys nearby paused from their chores to stare. They weren't used to seeing women around the ranch, especially one in a faded blue dress carrying a suitcase instead of a frying pan. Some of them laughed quietly, nudging each other. "City girl won't last a week," one cowboy muttered. Clara heard it, but she didn't react. She stood still, adjusting her hat against the sun, and tried to calm her nerves. She wasn't there to make friends. She just needed work, a place to sleep, and a roof that didn't leak. The man in charge, Jake Turner, the ranch foreman, came out of the barn wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at her with sharp, kind eyes that showed years of experience. "You the new cook?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Clara said softly. "I can cook for a dozen men, and I clean my own dishes. I just need a chance." Jake studied her for a moment and then nodded. "All right. The kitchen's yours. The men eat at sunrise, noon, and sunset. You keep them fed, you'll earn your pay. Don't let them fool you. Half of them are just boys who never had a home-cooked meal." She smiled slightly. "Yes, sir. I'll do my best." Jake pointed toward the old ranch house. "Kitchen's through there. Stove's temperamental, so watch her flame. You'll find supplies in the pantry. Don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it." Clara thanked him and walked inside. The kitchen smelled like old smoke and spilled coffee. The floor creaked under her boots, and a dusty window looked out at the corral. Everything seemed worn but full of stories. She opened the small book her mother had given her before she died, a handwritten recipe notebook filled with words like buttermilk biscuits and sweet corn stew. She touched the page gently, as if touching her mother's hand again. Outside, she could hear the laughter of cowboys, the sound of horses, and the clatter of metal tools. It was a rough world, but something about it felt alive. She rolled up her sleeves and began to work. By the time noon came, the smell of fresh cornbread and beans spread across the yard. One by one, the cowboys started to drift toward the kitchen door, drawn by the smell. Clara didn't say much, just filled plates and smiled politely. They looked at her in surprise. The food was simple but delicious, warm and full of flavor. Even Jake Turner raised his eyebrows in approval. In the corner of the table sat a tall cowboy with dark hair and a quiet face. He didn't joke like the others. He ate slowly, as if tasting every bite. His name was Eli Carter, though Clara didn't know it yet. He had the rough look of a man who'd worked the land all his life. Sun-browned skin, strong hands, and eyes that seemed to carry hidden thoughts. When Clara refilled his coffee cup, he looked up for the first time and nodded. "Good meal, ma'am," he said softly. "Thank you," Clara replied, shy but polite. After the meal, when the others went back to work, Eli stayed behind to help carry the heavy water bucket. "No need," Clara said quickly, wiping her hands on her apron. He shrugged. "You look like you've done enough heavy lifting for one day." She gave a small smile. "I'm used to work, mister." "I can tell," he said, and walked out again without another word. That night, Clara sat alone in her small room behind the kitchen. The wind blew softly outside, carrying the distant sound of cattle. She opened the window and looked out at the starlit plains. She felt both lonely and peaceful. Life here was hard but honest. She whispered a small prayer of thanks for having a roof and food, even if it was just the start. The next morning, before the sun rose, she was already in the kitchen, lighting the stove. The air was cold and her breath showed in the dim light. One by one, the men came in, surprised to find breakfast already waiting. Eggs, biscuits, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Jake smiled as he filled his plate. "You might just last here after all." From the doorway, Eli leaned against the frame, silent as ever. He watched her move with quiet focus, her hair tied back, her face soft in the early light. Something about her reminded him of a time before the wars, before he'd lost his father and taken over the ranch in secret. No one knew the truth about him, that he was not just a hired hand, but the man who owned every acre they stood on. Years ago, he had chosen to live among his workers to understand the kind of men his father's land attracted. Pretending to be just another cowboy made life simpler, and it kept greedy men away. But now, watching Clara work with quiet strength, he felt something shift inside him, something warm and unfamiliar. Days turned into weeks. Clara slowly became part of the ranch's rhythm. She learned every cowboy's favorite meal, who liked strong coffee, who liked it sweet. She laughed more often now, though softly, like a woman remembering how to smile again. The men stopped teasing her. Some even helped carry supplies without being asked. One afternoon, as she hung laundry behind the kitchen, she noticed Eli fixing a broken fence post nearby. Sweat glistened on his neck as he worked silently, focused on his task. When he looked up and caught her watching, she quickly turned away, embarrassed. "Need any help?" he asked, smiling faintly. "No," she said, trying not to sound nervous. "But thank you." Eli nodded, his eyes kind. "You work hard. The ranch hasn't felt this alive in years." "It's just food," she said. He shook his head. "It's more than that. You give these men something to come home to." His words stayed with her long after he walked away. That night she sat on her bed, staring at her mother's recipe book again. Maybe, she thought, life wasn't only about surviving. Maybe it was also about belonging somewhere. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Clara stepped outside to watch the sky turn orange and pink. Eli passed by with his horse and stopped beside her. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said. "Yes," she whispered. "It feels like the world stops for a moment." Eli looked at her quietly. "Out here you learn that simple things are the only things that last." She looked up at him, his face gentle but unreadable. "You sound like someone who's lost a lot." He smiled a little. "Maybe. Or someone who's seen what matters." Then he tipped his hat and rode away, leaving her standing under the soft glow of the setting sun. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She thought about his words, about the kindness he showed her, and the strange mystery around him. Who was he really? Why did the other men respect him more than anyone else? Something told her Eli Carter wasn't just another cowboy. But for now she didn't ask. She just kept cooking, working, and building her quiet new life. Unaware that the land she walked on, the kitchen she stood in, and even the roof above her head all belonged to the man who had just told her the sunset was beautiful. She had no idea how much her life, and his, was about to change. The days passed quietly, and life on the ranch began to fall into a gentle rhythm. Clara woke before the sun each morning to start the fire, boil the coffee, and knead dough for biscuits. The Cowboys trusted her now. They often brought her small gifts, a wildflower, a new tin cup, or a handful of berries from the creek. She would thank them kindly, then go back to her work. But one man stood apart from the rest, Eli Carter. He wasn't loud like the others. He never bragged or teased. Yet whenever something broke or someone was in trouble, Eli was there. If a horse threw a shoe, he fixed it. If a storm was coming, he was the first to tie the fences. He worked hard, ate quietly, and always left a few extra pieces of firewood by the kitchen door at night. Clara noticed these things but said nothing. One morning, Jake Turner rode into town for supplies, leaving Clara to keep an eye on things. She decided to clean the kitchen and the small office connected to it. Dust had gathered everywhere, and the wooden shelves were full of old papers. She opened the window to let the wind in and began to wipe each corner carefully. As she stacked some papers on the desk, a thick old ledger caught her eye. It looked different from the others, heavy, leather-bound, and neat, as if someone cared for it. The edge of a folded page stuck out. Without meaning to pry, Clara opened it to straighten the paper and dusked and froze. On the first page was written, "Turner Ranch, property of Eli Carter." Her heart skipped. She read it again just to be sure. Beneath that line were lists of supplies, payments, and land deeds, all signed in the same careful handwriting. Eli Carter. She stood still for a long moment, the book open in her hands. Eli, the quiet cowboy who worked beside the others, was the owner of the entire ranch. It didn't make sense. Why would a man with money and power live like a simple hand, sleeping in a bunkhouse, eating the same food, and working under the sun? Clara quickly closed the book and placed it back exactly where she found it. She didn't want anyone to know she had seen it. Her hands shook slightly as she continued cleaning, but her mind was far away. That afternoon, Eli came into the kitchen carrying a broken saddle strap. "Miss Clara," he said softly, "can you spare a bit of string? I need to tie this before the ride." She nodded, trying to hide her nervousness. "Of course." "There's some by the shelf." Their eyes met for a second. His were calm, warm, and steady, eyes of someone with no pride or show. She almost asked him about the ledger right then but stopped herself. It wasn't her place. For the next few days, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time Eli passed by, she watched him differently. She noticed how the others respected him quietly, how Jake asked for his opinion before making any big decision. Everything made sense now. He wasn't just another worker. He was the heart of the ranch. One evening, when the men were out mending fences, Clara sat on the porch peeling potatoes. Eli returned early, leading his horse slowly. He looked tired but peaceful. He tied his horse and walked toward her. "You always work too hard," he said with a small smile. "I could say the same to you," she replied. "You never rest," he chuckled softly. "Work keeps me honest." For a moment they sat in silence. The wind blew through the tall grass and the sound of cattle drifted in the distance. Clara looked at him and wanted to ask why he hid his name, why he didn't tell the others who he really was. But she didn't. She simply said, "You care about this place a lot, don't you?" Eli nodded. "It's been in my family for generations. My father built it from nothing. After he passed, I wanted to see the land through the eyes of those who work it. Money can build fences, but only people keep a ranch alive." Clara listened quietly. He had just confirmed what she already knew, but without pride or arrogance. There was something gentle in his words that touched her heart. That night, after dinner, a few cowboys gathered around the fire outside. They told stories and laughed loudly. Clara stayed inside washing dishes. Through the open window, she heard one of them say, "If the boss was still alive, he'd be proud. This place is running smoother than ever." "The boss is dead," another said. "Now it's just us and Jake." Eli didn't speak. He simply poked the fire with a stick and looked into the flames. Clara saw his face from the window, calm but with a hint of sadness. Later, when everyone went to sleep, Clara stepped outside to take in the cool night air. Eli was still there, sitting alone by the dying fire. She hesitated but then walked closer. "Can't sleep?" he asked without looking up. "Not much," she replied softly. "Too many thoughts in my head." He smiled faintly. "Thoughts can be heavier than a horse saddle sometimes." She laughed quietly, then said, "You must think a lot too. You seem like a man who carries the weight of many things." Eli looked at her then, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "Maybe, but some weights are worth carrying." Something in his tone made her heart ache. She wanted to tell him she knew, that she understood the secret he kept, but she chose silence. It wasn't her secret to reveal. Over the next week, the ranch went through hard times. A shipment of supplies was delayed, and Jake worried about running short on feed. Eli worked day and night trying to keep things steady. Clara cooked longer hours, sometimes staying up late to bake bread and keep everyone fed. One afternoon, when the wind picked up and dust swirled around the corral, Clara came outside to hand out cold lemonade to the men. Eli took his glass and smiled. "You keep us alive, Miss Clara." "I just cook," she said, smiling back. He looked at her with quiet kindness. "You do more than that. You give this place warmth." Her cheeks turned red and she looked away. "You're kind to say that." He didn't answer, but his gaze lingered for a moment before he returned to work. That evening, after supper, Jake returned from town with good news, and the missing supplies had finally arrived. The men cheered and the ranch was alive with laughter again. Clara baked an extra batch of biscuits that night, and Eli insisted on helping her clean up afterward. As he handed her the last clean plate, their hands brushed. For a moment, neither moved. There was no need for words. The air between them felt still, quiet, and full of something unspoken. Then Eli stepped back, clearing his throat. "You should rest, Miss Clara. You've done enough for today." She nodded softly. "Good night, Mr. Carter." He paused, surprised that she used his last name. "You know?" She looked up with a calm smile. "I found the ledger while cleaning. I didn't mean to, but I saw your name." He looked at her quietly for a long moment, then smiled gently. "I figured you might have. You're too sharp not to notice." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked softly. Eli looked out the window at the moonlit fields. "Because people act different when they know who's in charge. I wanted to be just another man for a while. To earn their respect, not buy it." Clara nodded slowly, her heart full of admiration. "You've earned more than respect. These men follow you because they trust you." He turned to her and smiled faintly. "And what about you, Miss Clara?" "Do you trust me?" She held his gaze and whispered, "Yes, I do." Eli nodded once as if that answer meant more to him than anything else. "Then that's enough for me." He tipped his hat, wished her good night, and walked out into the darkness. Clara stood by the window long after he was gone. The moonlight shimmered across the open land, and a quiet feeling filled her heart. She had come here only for a job, but now she was part of something bigger, something real. She didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in years, she felt like she truly belonged. And out there in the distance, Eli Carter, the secret owner, the quiet man, rode slowly along the fence line, watching over his land and the woman who had unknowingly changed his life. The summer sun burned hot across the wide land, and the sky turned pale with dry wind. It had been weeks since a drop of rain, and the earth cracked under the hooves of the cattle. Clara worked harder than ever, trying to make enough food for the tired men. She noticed Eli growing quieter as the days went on. Something weighed on his mind, though he never said what. Every evening he rode out to check the fences, coming back after dark with dust on his hat and silence in his eyes. The men respected him, but few dared to ask what was troubling him. Clara, however, could feel it, that quiet worry he carried deep inside. One afternoon, Jake returned from town with a grim face. "There's a storm brewing south," he said. "They say it's bad, lightning, heavy wind, maybe even flooding. Tie everything down before nightfall." Everyone rushed to prepare. Horses were brought into the stable, tools locked up, and windows nailed shut. The air grew strange and heavy, the sky turning dark purple long before sunset. Clara ran around the kitchen, moving sacks of flour and barrels of grain away from the windows. As the first drops of rain began to fall, she heard Eli shouting orders outside. His voice rose above the wind, calm but strong. "Secure the ropes. Move the cattle to high ground." The cowboys obeyed quickly, trusting him completely. Clara lit the lamps in the kitchen, her hands trembling. The storm was rolling closer now. The wind howled like a living thing, and lightning flashed bright enough to light the whole ranch. She could feel the walls shake as thunder exploded overhead. Then came a sudden loud crash outside. The roof of the bunkhouse had started to lift. Without thinking, Clara grabbed her shawl and ran out into the rain. The storm hit her like a wall. Wind tore at her dress and hair, and rain soaked her instantly. She could barely see through the downpour, but she ran toward the bunkhouse, shouting for the men. "The roof! It's coming loose!" The cowboys were already there, trying to hold the ropes that kept the tin roof from flying off. But the wind was too strong. One rope slipped from a man's hand, whipping through the air like a snake. Clara rushed forward and grabbed it with both hands, digging her boots into the muddy ground. "Clara, let it go," someone yelled, but she didn't listen. She held on with all her strength, her arms burning. Just then, a flash of lightning struck nearby, lighting up the field, and in that flash she saw Eli running toward her. He reached her side, grabbed the rope, and pulled it from her grip. "Get back inside," he shouted over the wind. "I can help," she cried. "You've done enough," he said firmly. "Go before you get hurt." But Clara refused to leave. She took another rope and tied it around the post, her hair plastered to her face by rain. Eli looked at her, frustration and worry mixing in his eyes. Together they fought the storm, tying and pulling until the roof was secure. By the time the wind began to ease, both were covered in mud and shivering. The bunkhouse was safe, but the kitchen door had blown open and rain was pouring inside. Without thinking, they ran back to fix it. Inside, the lamps flickered weakly, their light reflecting off the wet floor. Clara dropped to her knees, trying to dry the counter with an old towel. Her hands were numb from cold. Eli knelt beside her, picking up a fallen pot. "You should be resting," he said, his voice softer now. "I couldn't," she whispered. "The food would be ruined, and the men need it. They've worked too hard." Eli looked at her, shaking his head slightly. "You think of everyone but yourself?" She gave a small, tired smile. "I guess that's how my mother raised me." They worked in silence for a while, the sound of rain tapping the windows. Slowly, the storm began to fade. The air inside the kitchen felt heavy but calm. Clara leaned against the table, breathing deeply. Eli stood across from her, water dripping from his hat. When their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. For a long moment, neither said a word. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "You never told anyone why you live like this," she said softly. "Not even Jake." Eli took off his hat, running a hand through his wet hair. It's easier this way, he said quietly. When my father died, I didn't want to live as the boss. I wanted to see who cared about this place for real. I wanted to know who worked for pride, not for money. Clara listened carefully, her heart full. And what did you find? He looked at her, his voice low and honest. I found that hard work doesn't need a title. But I also found something else. Something I didn't expect. She tilted her head. What's that? Eli hesitated, his eyes softening. You. The word hung in the air like a secret. Clara blinked, unsure what to say. Her heart beat faster and the warmth in her chest grew despite the cold. You came here with nothing, Eli said gently. You took a place that had grown quiet and brought life back into it. The men laugh again, the meals feel like home. I didn't realize how much I missed that until you arrived. Clara lowered her eyes, trying to hide her smile. I just cook, she said. No, he whispered, taking a step closer. You build. You give people a reason to stay. The wind outside howled one last time, then fell silent. Only the dripping sound of rain remained. Eli stood near her, his presence calm and steady. She could see the kindness in his face and the kind of warmth that comes from a life of quiet strength. I didn't mean to discover your secret, she said softly. But I'm glad I did. You're not like other men, Eli, he smiled faintly. Maybe because I stopped trying to be. A moment of silence passed between them again, gentle and full of understanding. Then Eli stepped back, looking out the window at the soaked land. When the sun comes up, we'll need to check the fences, he said. There's still work to do, Clara nodded. I'll make something hot for breakfast. The men will need it. Eli looked at her one last time before heading for the door. Clara, he said softly, you don't have to prove anything here. You already belong. Those words stayed with her long after he left. She stood alone in the quiet kitchen, her heart warm despite the cold. When morning came, the ranch looked washed clean by the rain. The fields shimmered with puddles and the sky glowed pale blue. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sense of peace. The men were tired but cheerful, joking about how the bunkhouse roof had nearly flown to Mexico. Eli worked beside them as always, pretending to be just another cowboy. But everyone could see how the ranch moved around him, how his calm voice and steady hands guided everything. As Clara brought out breakfast, Jake came over and clapped her shoulder. If you hadn't stayed up last night, we'd all be hungry today. You did good, Miss Hill, she smiled shyly. It was nothing. Eli, standing a few feet away, caught her eye and gave a small nod, a silent thank you only she could read. For the rest of the day, Clara couldn't stop thinking about what he had said and that she belonged. No one had said those words to her in years. The world had taken so much from her family, her home, but here on this ranch, she had found a place where her kindness mattered. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, Clara stood by the porch watching the fields glow. Eli walked up beside her quietly. The land looks alive again, she said softly. He nodded. It always comes back if you take care of it. She looked at him and smiled. People are like that too, I think. Eli turned to her, the corners of his eyes softening. You might be right. The two stood together in silence, the wind gently moving the grass. For the first time since Clara's arrival, there was no wall between them. Only understanding, respect, and something tender growing quietly like a seed in good soil. Neither of them said more. They didn't need to. The storm had taken away the fear between them and left only truth, the kind that speaks without words. And as the stars appeared one by one across the wide Texas sky, Clara felt sure of one thing. She was no longer just the cook on someone else's land. She was part of a story, his story and the land's story. And that night, under the calm sky, it truly felt like home. The days after the storm were bright and calm. The air smelled fresh, and the sky looked like a clean blue sheet stretched above the endless land. The ranch was alive again. The grass shimmered with new green, and the cattle grazed quietly near the creek. Clara went back to her routine, cooking 3 meals a day, baking bread and keeping the kitchen warm. The men were in good spirits. They worked hard and joked even harder. Jake Turner said the storm had been a blessing in disguise. It washed away the dust and made men out of cowboys. He laughed one morning as he helped Clara carry a sack of flour inside. Eli seemed lighter too. He still worked from dawn to dusk, but he smiled more now. Sometimes when Clara passed him a plate or a cup of coffee, Their eyes met, and that quiet spark of understanding flashed between them again, something they both felt but never spoke about. But peace doesn't last long on any ranch. Trouble has a way of finding open land. One afternoon, two well-dressed men rode up to the ranch. Their horses were clean and their boots shiny, a clear sign they were not ranch hands. Jake noticed them first and walked out to greet them, wiping his hands on his jeans. Clara watched from the porch, her apron still in her hand. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Jake said. "What brings you out here?" The taller man dismounted. "We're from the town bank," he said in a clipped voice. "We're here on business with the owner of this property." Jake's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of business?" "Legal business," the man said. "There's a matter of ownership that needs reviewing." Eli stepped out from the stable just then, calm as ever. "What kind of review?" he asked, his voice even. The banker looked him up and down, clearly not realizing who he was. "We were told there's confusion regarding the late Mr. Carter's estate. Someone has stepped forward claiming rights to this land." The other man pulled out papers from a leather folder. "A Mr. Samuel Crane, son of Mr. Carter's former business partner. He claims the deed was never fully transferred after your father's passing." A low murmur ran through the men nearby. They stopped their work and stared. Jake's jaw tightened. "That's nonsense," he said. "This land's been run by Eli Carter since—" He stopped suddenly, realizing he'd said the name aloud in front of the bankers and the men. The taller banker blinked. "Eli Carter? Then you're the owner?" Eli nodded slowly, not denying it. "Yes, I am." Whispers spread among the cowboys like wind through dry grass. Some looked surprised, others simply nodded as if they had known all along. Clara stood frozen at the porch, her heart pounding. The banker smiled faintly, though his eyes stayed cold. "Then you'll understand why we need to verify everything. Until this matter is settled, the ranch may face temporary claim restrictions. That means no sale, no purchases, and no banking access." Jake frowned. "That could ruin us." Eli's voice stayed calm. "You'll get your verification. I have the original deed signed by my father." The banker nodded. "Good. We'll return in 2 days to collect it." When they rode off, a heavy silence hung in the air. The men returned to work slowly, whispering among themselves. Jake came to Eli. "You going to show them the papers?" "I will," Eli said. "But I'll need to find them." "They're in an old ledger." Clara's heart skipped. She knew exactly where that ledger was. She had seen it weeks ago when she cleaned the office. That evening, when the sun dropped behind the hills, Clara waited in the kitchen, thinking hard. Eli had gone to the stable, looking worried for the first time since she'd known him. She could tell he was carrying the burden alone. Finally, she took a lantern and went to the office. The air inside smelled of old paper and dust. She found the ledger where it had always been, behind a stack of worn books. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. There it was, by the deed written in strong ink. Turner Ranch, property of Eli Carter. Beneath it were signatures, official seals, and dated entries showing full ownership. She heard the door creak behind her. Eli stood there, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a faint shadow of worry on his face. "You shouldn't be in here," he said gently. Clara turned, holding up the ledger. "You're looking for this." He paused, then sighed. "You remembered." "I did," she said. "And I think you should show it to them tomorrow. They need proof, and this is it." Eli nodded slowly. "Thank you, Clara. You always seem to know what needs doing before I ask." She smiled faintly. "I just don't like unfair things." For a long moment they stood there quietly, the lantern light flickering between them. Then Eli took the ledger, closing it carefully. "I'll ride into town first thing." "You've done enough." But Clara wasn't finished. "If those men come back with more lies, you'll need someone to speak for you. You know they won't believe a cowboy even if he owns the land." Eli frowned slightly. "And what makes you think they'll listen to a cook?" Her chin lifted. "Because I'm not afraid to tell the truth." The next morning came bright and windy. Clara was up early, cooking breakfast as usual, but everyone could feel the tension in the air. Around noon, the bankers returned, this time with a third man, a lawyer. They dismounted, looking sure of themselves. Eli stepped out to meet them, holding the ledger. Clara stood nearby, watching closely. "We've brought documentation," the banker said smugly, proof that the Carter estate transfer was incomplete. Eli handed him the ledger without a word. The man flipped through it carelessly. "What's this?" Old numbers? Keep reading, Clara said firmly from behind Eli. The banker shot her an irritated glance but kept turning pages. When he reached the deed, his expression changed. The lawyer leaned closer, adjusting his glasses. Well, he said slowly, this looks official. It is, Clara said. Signed, sealed, and dated before the bank was even founded. You can verify it in the county records if you like. The banker hesitated, clearly uncomfortable being corrected by a woman in a flour-dusted apron. Still, the claim is false, Clara said, stepping forward. Mr. Carter's father built this land from nothing, and this man, she pointed at Eli, kept it alive through drought, loss, and storms. You don't get to walk in here and call it yours just because you found a paper. The men around her had stopped working to listen. Even Jake looked stunned. Eli stood silent beside her, his eyes on her face. The lawyer finally closed the ledger. She's right. This deed is valid. The land belongs fully to Mr. Carter. The bankers exchanged a frustrated glance. One cleared his throat. Very well. We'll report that to the bank. They turned and left without another word. The moment they rode off, the Cowboys burst into cheers. Jake slapped Eli on the shoulder, laughing. Well, boss, guess your secret's truly out now. Eli smiled, shaking his head. Seems so, but his eyes went to Clara. She stood quietly, her apron still dusted with flour, her cheeks flushed from speaking out. That evening, as the sun painted the land gold again, the men gathered around the fire, singing and laughing louder than ever. The ranch had been saved, and everyone knew who to thank. Inside the kitchen, Clara was cleaning up when Eli walked in. You spoke like you were born for it, he said softly. I just told the truth, she replied, smiling shyly. You did more than that, he said. You stood by me when you didn't have to. Clara looked at him, her voice warm and steady. You stood by me when I had nothing. I was only returning the favor. Eli's eyes softened. You've changed this place, Clara. You've changed me. She blushed and looked down, brushing crumbs off the table. I didn't mean to, he smiled. Maybe that's why it happened. The sound of laughter echoed from outside, and for the first time in a long while, the ranch felt whole. The land, the men, the kitchen, everything seemed brighter, stronger, alive again. As the last light of day faded, Eli placed the ledger on the shelf where it belonged. I'll keep this safe, he said. Clara nodded. You should. It's more than paper. It's your family. Eli looked at her gently. And maybe now it's yours too. Her eyes widened slightly, but before she could speak, he tipped his hat and walked out into the twilight. Clara stood alone, her heart full and trembling. The man who once hid behind a name had finally been seen for who he was. And in standing beside him, she had found her own strength. Outside, the sky turned red and purple over the open land. And for the first time in years, both of them felt something rare, peace that came from truth and the quiet hope of what might come next. The weeks after the bank men left were peaceful and full of warmth. The ranch felt alive again, full of laughter, clinking coffee cups, and the smell of fresh bread drifting through the air each morning. The Cowboys worked harder than ever, but their spirits were high. They respected Eli even more now that they knew who he really was. But what touched them most was how he stayed the same, still working beside them, still eating the same meal, still living simply. Clara became the quiet heart of the ranch. Every morning before the sun rose, she lit the stove, baked biscuits, and hummed softly while she cooked. Her hands moved with love and care. She didn't realize that her soft singing had become part of the ranch's rhythm, that even the horses seemed calmer when her voice floated through the open windows. Eli often found reasons to stop by the kitchen. Sometimes he brought her fresh eggs, sometimes a bunch of wildflowers he'd picked by the creek. He always claimed it was for decoration, but Clara knew better. The other Cowboys teased him behind his back, whispering things like, "The boss sure loves his cook's biscuits more than ours." But he only smiled and went on his way. One crisp morning, Clara stood outside watching the sunrise turn the fields golden. She felt proud of what she'd built here, proud that the men respected her, and proud that the ranch had become her home. She thought of her mother and how she'd always said, "A kitchen isn't just for food, it's for love, kindness, and strength." Clara smiled softly. Her mother had been right. Eli came up behind her holding 2 tin mugs of coffee. "You're up early," he said. I always am, she replied, taking the cup from his hand. Old habits, he looked out at the land. Hard to believe how much it's changed in a few months. Feels like a different place, Clara smiled. That's what happens when people care. He glanced at her. You've done more for this ranch than anyone ever could. She shook her head. I just cook, Mr. Carter. He laughed softly. You still call me that? Well, she said playfully, you are the boss. Eli chuckled and looked down at his boots. You know, I never liked that word. I don't want people to work for me. I want them to work with me. Clara nodded thoughtfully. That's why they do. The two stood quietly for a while, sipping their coffee as the light spread over the land. The moment felt simple, peaceful, and right. As the days went by, Clara noticed small changes around the ranch. The men built new fences, repaired the barn roof, and planted flowers near the porch. It was Eli's idea. He said the place deserved to look alive, not just work hard. But Clara knew he was doing it for her. He wanted her to feel that the ranch was truly hers too. One afternoon, Jake came into the kitchen grinning from ear to ear. Miss Hill, he said, the boss has something to show you. Clara looked up from kneading dough. Show me? Yep, says you should come down to the creek when you're done. Curious, Clara wiped her hands, took off her apron, and walked out into the soft sunlight. The path to the creek was lined with tall grass and little yellow flowers. The air smelled sweet. When she reached the water, she saw Eli standing beside a small wooden cabin she had never noticed before. It was simple but beautiful, fresh timber walls, a porch with a rocking chair, and smoke rising gently from a small chimney. Clara stopped, her eyes wide. What is this? Eli turned toward her, his hat in his hand. I built it for you. She blinked, not sure she heard right. For me? He nodded. You've worked harder than anyone here. You've given this ranch a heart again. It's only right you have a home of your own, not just a small room behind the kitchen. Clara took a few steps closer, her throat tight. Eli, I don't know what to say. Say you'll stay, he said softly. She looked around. The gentle water, the whispering trees, the tiny porch that looked like it was waiting for her. You built all this? Some of the men helped, he said with a smile. Jake handled the roof and I built the porch myself. I figured you'd want a place near the water. You always said it helped you think. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She turned away quickly, pretending to look at the creek. No one's ever done something like this for me before, she said in a trembling voice. Eli stepped closer. You've done more for all of us than you realize. This isn't a gift, Clara. It's a thank you. She turned back toward him, her heart full. You didn't have to. I wanted to, he interrupted gently. Because this place wouldn't be the same without you. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The sunlight danced on the water and the wind rustled through the grass. Then Eli handed her a small wooden box. There's something else, he said. Clara opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a deed. Her name was written on it, Clara Hill, owner of cabin number 2, Turner Ranch. She gasped softly. Eli, I can't accept this. You already did, he said with a smile. When you gave your heart to this land. Clara couldn't speak. Her eyes filled with tears again, and she covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Eli looked at her kindly. You gave me back something I'd lost. Faith in people, in this ranch, in life. This is my way of saying you belong here, Clara. This is your home now. For a moment she couldn't move. Then quietly she said, thank you. For seeing me as more than just a cook. Eli shook his head. You were never just that. You've been the soul of this place since the day you arrived. Clara smiled through her tears. Then I'll take care of it, like I've always done. He nodded. That's all I could ever ask. They walked through the little cabin together. Inside was a small bed with a handmade quilt, a table by the window, and shelves lined with jars and books. The air smelled of fresh wood and lavender. Clara ran her hand over the table and smiled softly. It's perfect, she whispered. As the evening sun painted the land gold, they stood on the porch together. The cowboys' laughter echoed faintly from far away, and the sound of the creek made the world feel peaceful. Eli turned to her. You know, my father used to say the land only belongs to those who love it. Maybe that's why it always felt empty before. No one loved it the way you do. Clara looked at him, her eyes shining. It's easy to love something that gives you a second chance. Eli smiled. Then maybe it gave us both one. They didn't say more. The silence between them was soft and full of meaning. When night came, the sky turned deep blue and stars began to appear one by one. Clara lit the lamp inside her new cabin and watched its glow spill across the porch. She sat in the rocking chair, feeling the quiet peace around her. Eli walked up a little later carrying a small basket. "Thought you might need supper," he said. She smiled. "You didn't have to," he grinned. "I wanted to." They ate together under the stars. Simple stew, bread, and coffee. They talked about the ranch, the men, and the plans for the coming spring. There was laughter, quiet moments, and that feeling of closeness that didn't need words. When Eli stood to leave, he looked down at her. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Eli," she said softly. He hesitated a moment, then tipped his hat and walked away into the starlit dark. Clara sat for a long time, listening to the crickets and the soft hum of the night. She looked at the paper in her hand and her name written in careful ink, and smiled. For the first time in her life, she truly belonged somewhere. In the morning, the ranch woke to the smell of fresh bread again. Clara stood in her new kitchen, sunlight streaming through the window, her heart calm and full. Outside, Eli rode across the fields, and when he passed by her cabin, he tipped his hat with a warm smile. She waved back, her face glowing with quiet happiness. The ranch had seen storms, doubts and trouble, but in the end it stood strong, just like the two people who had cared enough to keep it alive. And as the sun climbed higher, Clara whispered to herself, "I came here for a job, but I found a home."